Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a guest episode. I have Dr. Mike T. Nelson back on the podcast. So this is his probably fourth or fifth time on the podcast now at this point. And if you're not familiar with him, he's years of experience in the fitness industry. He doesn't have a ton of research, but he's done a lot of work around HRV. He has metabolic flexibility certification, physiologic flexibility certification, also cardio for meatheads certifications. And he is also the host of the Flex Diet podcast where he has a ton of great guests in there. So he definitely knows performance physiology, recovery physiology, stress physiology in and out. And I've learned a ton from Dr. Mike Nelson. And so what we talked about here is in this episode, we discussed cardio programming and progressive overload, just how a lot of people forget about how, you can use the concepts of progressive overload for weight training to cardio to improve that. We discussed some metabolic flexibility stuff. We discussed the new carbohydrate paper around that they claim to have debunked the high carbs there. So we discussed Dr. Mike's thoughts around that paper. We obviously dove into carbohydrates and performance, stress load and recovery capacity. We talked about some fasting and how he likes to use fasting and his concept of human dynamic range and why it's important to be able to do that. So a ton of great information in this episode. As always, Dr. Mike's super smart and he explains things very well. And I could go on and on with him for hours. So hope you enjoy this episode. First, before I dive into it though, I do have my one-on-one coaching. That's really the biggest part of my business. And if you are someone who is interested in body recomp, performance, stress load management, recovery, performing your best in and out of the gym, then my coaching is for you. And so the link to find out more about that is in the show notes. And then if you haven't yet, give me a follow on Instagram. That's where I'm most active. I hope you guys enjoy this episode with Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Dr. Mike, thanks for coming back on, man. I think we had you on in sometime in the summer there. So it's been, right. I feel like I have you on about twice a year.
Yeah,
that's
thank you.
The frequency now here. I didn't tell you this off air, but I was going to, but we ended up talking about a lot of different things. So I wrapped up PhysFlex, MetFlex, and I've done HRV and the Meathead level 1 cardio. Oh. I've almost completed all Dr. Mike's library there. Just got to get level 2, the anaerobic side of things. But how have things been going on your end the last 6 months or so?
Overall, it's been pretty good. It's been a little bit crazy we had some travel. We were down in South Padre again in November, end of October, November.
How often do you go down to South Padre?
We usually go down in the fall and spring. So I usually go down for about 4 weeks at a time. And yeah, the wind and fall was actually pretty good. I was going to learn how to foil and the water was like the lowest levels we've ever seen. And so you'd have to walk to freaking Mexico even to try to get any water depth. But yeah, it was good. Hit a couple jumps over 20 feet. So that's becoming more easy to do. I had one that I picked up I sent the kite a kind of goofy way and got picked straight up. And so that kind of freaked me out, but I landed it. And yeah, overall, it was a good trip. It was pretty fun.
Cool. Yeah. Anything else been going on from like a personal business standpoint? Anything like that over the last little bit?
Presentation for the trainers and coaches at F1 racing. So that was pretty fun. Did that on some recovery metrics and looking at respiratory rate, how it relates to resting heart rate, HRV, different markers, training schedule challenges, like how do you do up regulation, down regulation, how much strength training do you fit in with a busy schedule, and obviously they're doing high stress from physical and cognition standpoint. And that was super fun. They were all great, super cool. I had another conference in Virginia. Then we were back home for a while. We went to Steamboat, Colorado a week ago. So I got to do my first snowboarding, which was actually really fun. The snow there wasn't the greatest, but they found some good stuff, and they have access to I think 6,000 to 10,000 acres, and they've built like 50 miles of snowcat road, like all across the whole mountain range. So I did that with my sister, and yeah, it was super fun. It was a good time. Had about 4 days at the resort, and yeah, training's been going pretty good despite all the travel and everything else. Still working on picking up the 175-inch dumbbell. On a good day, I can get the 135 without any counterweight. It's still a little bit hit or miss, but I hit 290 and double overhand, a 2-inch axle the other day. So before we leave again, I'm going to see if I could maybe get to 300. Like 300 is kind of the next milestone on that. And then working that lift a little bit more because I wanted to do something that has grip and something that has lower body stuff for skiing and snowboarding.
What are you doing from like a cardio perspective? How many days a week do do that? Is that kind of the same, or do you change that up, or what's that look like for you?
Yeah, so I tried to keep everything pretty consistent. So when I was in South Padre, I did enough cardio to stay where I was. I actually cut back a little bit on cardio, and I'd say lifting was only 2 or 3 days a week. So maintenance, a lot of that depends on how good the wind is. If I can go out and ride 4 days a week, 5 days a week, then I put everything else on minimum. If the wind's dead, then I'll just train every day. So that's variable. So I came out of that and I didn't feel too bad. So unfortunately, I got sick after that. And then up to the end of December, back to normal. So typically, what I'll do is the 6 minute progressive. I've been getting back to just doing that most mornings. So probably days I'm going to lift, like so Monday, Tuesday, Thursday. Usually I skip Saturday, and I'll do it on another cardio day. So I'll do that 4 or 5 days a week, sometimes 6 days a week. And then Wednesday, Friday, I'll do more just a progressive cardio block. So what I found, if my lifting volume is high, I find I can work up to just a 20-minute capacity row or like about a 5K. So I did that yesterday. So I got, what I get, 4,850 meters in 20 minutes. Not a PR, RPE of around an 8 or so. And usually if I can get to that marker, like I feel pretty good. If I were to do an all-out test and my 5K is below 20 minutes, like for me, that's generally a pretty good marker. My 2K at that time is probably like 7:32, 7:35, somewhere around there. So I think that's probably good enough to stay there. And I had some pretty easy pickups just by increasing frequency, keeping the duration shorter. I haven't really dropped in any interval training. So if I really wanted to push my VO2 max, I would sub a day of lifting for some heavy intervals. But right now, I'd say lifting's probably a higher priority. So coming out of South Padre, so probably May or June, I'll probably do a more intensive aerobic block. And then I'm going to do more, now that when skiing and snowboarding is over, probably just do more specific stuff with the inch dumbbell. So I've got 100-pound inch, 135, and then 175. So just try to do more specificity on that at the same time. So yeah, a lot of it is just figuring out what your priorities are, how much time you have, what is the biggest transfer, what are your goals? Because the biggest mistake I think I've made in the past, and I know everyone's made this, is when you get to like an intermediate-ish or higher end intermediate level, or you've just been doing this shit for a long period of time, you just really have to be super intensive on what is your goal and making progress towards that. As of right now, I'll admit that, yeah, some of my goal is more lower body stuff. Is that taking away from some grip stuff? Yes. But things like the axle, things like that will transfer to both. And then once the snowboard season is done, I've probably got enough leg strength for kiteboarding, so I'm probably fine. I can make it more specific. And if I was to drop in interval training now to try to push my VO2 max higher more aggressively, the schedule, training, sleep, everything else, I would be a crispy critter in about 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's what I like about it too. You don't necessarily need to stick to, you can have different blocks where, like you said, it's maybe a little bit more focused on lifting, a little bit more focused on cardio. And I think it depends on what your goal is. And I think what your baseline is too. What do you need? What do you need more work on? What have you been doing? Because I did that recently where it was more of a cardio focus. And then now I've gone back
Nice.
to a little bit more back to hypertrophy again, 4 days, but still doing a couple days of cardio there. And I think that's cool to be able to shift and not feel like you have to just do one forever, right? It's like you can go back and forth. And what are your goals at that time there with your progressive six? So it sounds like right now, since lifting's kind of your main goal, it sounds like you're doing progressive six, like, did you say 5, 6 days a week, something like that, right?
Somewhere around there, yeah.
And then you're doing one kind of like 20-minute capacity cardio, right? Is that kind of what your overall
Usually
cardio
2 to 3.
Oh, you're doing 2 to 3 of those.
Yeah. So how I think about it is, can I do some? I'm a big, like the cardio stuff, I'm a huge fan of frequency. So in a perfect world, can you just take your total frequency and just split it out over the course of a week? So for on Monday, which is more a higher volume upper body day, in the morning, I'll just do the 6-minute progressive. I won't do any other cardio the rest of the day because my upper body session's an hour and a half, 2 hours. Tuesday is a little bit more grip focused. So I'll do 6 minutes in the morning, and then I'll probably do a 500 meter at an RP of a 7 before lifting. Wednesday is just a cardio day. So over the past 6 weeks, I've just bumped up the duration. So now I can do 20 minutes, like I said, at about 4,800 meters, and my HRV will be fine the next day. If I did that at that intensity Most of it's zone 4, touching zone 5. If I did that even 4 weeks ago, I could only get in one of those sessions a week. And so then Thursday's a little bit more lifting, to 6 minutes in the morning, maybe a 500-meter before lifting. Friday's back to cardio day, so now I'm up to the 20-minute block. Saturday is a lower body day, so I don't usually do any cardio before. And then Sunday's a flex day. Maybe I'll do easy cardio if I can. Maybe I'll do 10 minutes. Maybe I'll just do a 2K. It's whatever I feel like. And if my HRV is complete dog crap, then I'll just take it completely off, just do an unload, and then walk, and then back to the same cycle again on Monday.
And make sure are you just looking at any metrics with that, or is it just, hey, what is my output in my cardio sessions? Is that kind of what you're basing that off of, and making sure that you're maintaining or progressing?
Yeah, so I use RPE a lot and heart rate, and then just RPE for the distance. So when I came back from South Padre, like the 6-minute one, it was probably an RPE of an 8 to hit 1,500 meters. Now, yeah, on a good day, 1520 to 1540, probably an RPE of a 7 or an 8. And that's taken four-ish plus weeks. So I think it's just a slow progression, because I'm not really, there's too much variability from one day to the next. So the key is, can you do enough to get the output you want without like crushing yourself? Now, again, I could do a high RPE of a 9 and get much better than that, but to what reason? It's going to affect my training later in the day. It's going to affect my training the next day, versus, let's just make it a little bit easier, and then let's do it again the next day. And so just looking at those progressions over, not even day to day, but probably just week to week. And then with the submax stuff, if you've got enough history, you'll know submax wise, like where you're at, even maximal. So I know, like on a 6-minute progressive, if I'm at an RP of an 8 and I hit 1545 for meters, like if 1 to 2 weeks of specific practice, my 2Ks probably like 735, like somewhere in there. So you'll know by doing submax stuff where you are on the high end, also just based off your historical data. So usually for me, that's like a good point where I'll hold at that point. And if I have recovery bandwidth, then I'll just go to 7 minutes, 8 minutes, that type of thing over time.
So it does sound like it's mainly output focus, right? That you're kind of that, and just making sure that's slowly progressing on there. And I'm assuming, obviously, if it's lifting's a little bit more of a priority for you right now, then you're going to just expect slower-ish progress with the cardio, but you're okay with that, because it's not like your main focus at the moment. Whereas if you wanted that to be like what you really want to improve, you're obviously going to put more time towards that. And I'm assuming you'd want to see maybe quicker progressions than at that point, if that was like your kind of main goal at that moment in time.
Yeah, because it's all about trade-off. So I have to get some room somewhere else. I either have to get more time to do walking and down regulation and that type of stuff to have enough ability to recover, more time to sleep. So I have to invest some time somewhere in that. And then with the current schedule and projects and stuff I've got going on, if I want to keep lifting the top priority, currently right now, I'm probably lifting 7 hours a week. So I would have to probably exchange out, like I said before, one of those higher intensity days for like probably an interval-based work. Because I find like interval-based stuff gets most people recovery similar to a pretty hard training day. But again, there's where you have to pick. So for now, lifting's a bigger goal. I feel like my recovery is good enough between sets and everything else. Yeah, I'd like to progress the cardio a little bit more, but I'm not going to really increase the intensity that much, because it's going to take away from something else, and I just don't have the time to invest more into down regulation. And the other part too is I'm not doing this in a caloric deficit, so I purposely dramatically increased my calories. So I came back from South Padre, I left, did not weigh anything, did not log anything, did not ate Pop-Tarts after kiteboarding, drank beer, not a lot, just some. My body weight was within half a pound of when I left. Like, you do stuff long enough, you know where you're at. And again, I ate more protein, got a lot of exercise, got good sleep, etc. Then in December, I thought, it's the holidays, I might as well increase calories more. And I don't know if you've noticed this too, but the longer you do stuff, the more nonlinear the responses tend to be. So by the end of December, I was at 247. And then I was like, I feel fat. So I'm like, I'll just try to hang out at maintenance. And then it turns out that maintenance, because that was the highest point I've been ever, you'll just drift back down and you'll find you'll just hit a new plateau. So like right now, the past probably 2.5 weeks, I've been at like about 242, pretty much plus or minus 1 or 2 pounds. And that seems to be a little bit better body comp. Recovery's still good. And so I'll probably hang out here for a while and then decide if I'm going to go up or down again. So all that to say, if you're really trying to be aggressive with goals, like you probably don't want to do it in a caloric deficit, because I've tried to do that in the past and just completely imploded everything after about 4 weeks.
Yep. Yeah, no, well, I think that again, especially if you want to do, the more you want to do and the quicker you want that weight to come off or the steeper the deficit, it's like that's going to start to add up. So you got to make sure that you're not pushing one of those there. But I think the trick too, for a lot of people, especially if they're very body comp focused, is like when they hear, like for some people, increasing calories can cause some anxiety, but if you're doing more training to try to progress something, that you bring up your calories, it's like it's going to even out there. I think that itself would maybe bring up your maintenance calories even a bit more, because you're just doing more output with enough calories, where like if you're trying to do all this output with less calories, your body almost adapts to that in a way as well too.
Yeah, and I got pretty aggressive because my performance kept going up, so I just kept adding more calories. And again, I would probably not recommend clients do this right away, but I was up to post lifting 150, 170 grams of carbohydrates just in the meal post lifting. Yeah.
That's a good amount of carbohydrates after a meal or after
Yeah.
a workout. It's fun though. Tastes good too.
Yeah. And it was, again, if I wasn't seeing the increase in training performance, like
Yep.
I probably wouldn't have been that aggressive. But I'm like, shit, every time I increase calories, my training's better. And then after about 4 weeks, I plateaued out and I'm like, oh yeah, now I'm just getting really fat. So I'm like, okay, probably time to go back down or at least hang out here and see what happens.
Yeah, no, that is super interesting how that happens, which is maybe a topic that I want to talk about later, because I do want to park that. But real quick with your 6 minute progressive, you said you kind of keep your RPE around like 7 to 8 on that, right? And you try to hit that regularly because we're trying to hit frequency side of things there from a cardio standpoint. And again, are you focused on output in that? Are you trying to progress that output during that time, or is it just like matching it over time that you're looking at there?
Yeah, the biggest thing with that I find is just getting the work in and actually trying to keep the RPE around the same.
Okay.
Because you will have days that fluctuate. I had I had 3 days back to back this week where, because of schedule and stuff going on, I ended up working till 9:30, 10 o'clock at night by the time I got done, which historically not very good for your recovery. Shocker, go figure. So yeah, the next morning doing that, performance was down a little bit, but I'm like, okay, that kind of makes sense, right? But I'm still getting a benefit from doing it versus not doing it. Okay, my output there was only 1505. Okay, whatever, it is what it is. It recovered the next day once I got sleep. So I'm trying to keep the RPE the same, where I think the issue with a high frequency submax program is people tend to push the intensity too much. Just like lifting. If you've got high frequency, you probably can't get away doing high intensity all the time.
Yeah, makes sense.
So with higher frequency, just trying to keep it at a true RPE of an 8. And then just looking week to week, are you making a little bit of progress over time? Because again, I think just getting some of those intervals in is the biggest driver for adaptation. And the other reason it's 6 minutes is it's not really a safety, but I'd say a performance standpoint. If you're not doing a warm up and you go bananas for 6 minutes, you're really not going to be able to do that much damage unless you're like a really high level athlete. So by just keeping it to a shorter time domain, I've realized that because a lot of stuff works maybe with yourself or with other populations, but when you expand it out to the general populace, now you're trying to get the widest response from just something simple. I realize that the 6 minutes, even 6 minutes versus 8 minutes, again, it's all anecdotal. If people got the intensity wrong and they only did it for 6 minutes, they wouldn't really mess themselves up too bad. But you start getting into longer time domains, 8 minutes, and you're going all out, like you just start accumulating more fatigue because of that.
It's like it reminds me of the RIR, right? Where I know there's not an exact science to this, but you can get good gains from like 1 to 2 RIR, but then once you go to that 0 RIR, it's like maybe the fatigue now starts to like, it's just a lot more than what it would be if you stay a couple reps away from failure, but you're like not getting a ton more adaptation from that, just a lot more fatigue on there. Obviously there's more that goes into it, but it reminds me of something like that. And so it sounds like the 6 minutes is just a way to hedge your bets against overdoing the intensity on there. Because if you're going to do it regularly, you do want to watch your intensity, like you said there, which in your meathead cardio course, you did a good job of coming at this from a meathead standpoint. You did a really good job of explaining progressive overload with cardio, right? I think we think of those as two separate things. And it's
Yeah.
like, you could just try and progressively overload in your weight training. You can use that for your cardio as well too, right? Like you said, more output, whether that's watts or speed or whatever you're using for that, or longer distances. But again, over time, like tracking your output is going to be the best way to go about it. And I think people forget about tracking their output when it comes to cardio, and not utilizing the concept of progressive overload for their cardio. I know that's been the biggest game changer for me when it comes to cardio.
Yeah, it's weird. That was one of those things that I just assumed people did. And then when I started working with more and more people, I was like, oh, they're like, I just do 15, 20 minutes of cardio Tuesday, Thursday.
Yep.
And I'm like, okay, that's good. But what, have you ever changed it? Have you ever done more? Have you ever done less? I don't know. That's just what I do. Okay, so maybe that's enough to keep you where you're at. Maybe. But yeah, that's why I love using the rower, the assault bike, even just an old bike. I've got my high school bike. I put on a friggin' trainer, put a $20 Bluetooth Garmin thing on the back that just tells me speed. I don't need strain gauges in my pedals or anything too fancy. Just some way to measure output relative to where you were. And yeah, over time, you should have some progressive output. I think for whatever reason, especially in physique world, like cardio is just, it's just a caloric drain. It's okay, yeah, maybe when I work with someone who's 6, 8 weeks, 12 weeks out from a show, yeah, we do some faster cardio. We are primarily using it as a caloric drain. But off season, we're going to push it for adaptations just like we would anything else. Again, you don't need VO2 max is 65 or 70. I think my buddy Andy Galpin's talked about this too. If you're a meathead and you can hit a VO2 max of 50, that's probably more than sufficient. If you've got other gains you want to get better, cool. And there are freaks who are definitely higher than that for sure. But I think that's probably good enough. But just like you said, if you want to see adaptation, you have to present the body with doing more than it did before. And then you also have to be systematic with how you're going to apply that stress, because most people lifting, either, yes, you can do a block of cardio, but most of the time they can make some pretty good progress with just kind of boring, basic cardio, following some simple rules. And I don't know what you've noticed, but I've noticed if you're really only training for hypertrophy and you're not going to absolute failure a lot, you can get away with doing a high amount of cardio and a high amount of hypertrophy training pretty easily. If you start getting into pushing strength stuff and lower reps and you're maybe super advanced and you need to go closer to failure, then it gets a little bit tricky. But I think you've got a lot more wiggle room there than what most people realize.
100%. And I think where people probably go most wrong with it is they don't take care of their nutrition or the recovery side of
assuming
things,
your
right?
nutrition and sleep are halfway decent.
Yeah, I feel like that ends up being the biggest bottleneck for people with that. But yeah, you could, as long as you're dosing it properly, I feel training with the right intensity, and from cardio, you're not just doing 30 minutes where you're just absolutely killing yourself every single time and doing whatever, then yeah, I definitely feel like you can get away with a lot more than what you think there with both of those.
Yeah. And our buddy Brian Bornstein, he's a good example of that, even as a natural athlete.
Yep. Yeah, no, it's definitely something that I'm trying to get more and more people to do, is focus on cardio. I find that focusing on progressive overload with it, I feel, is a good way to defy it for people and make it a little bit more interesting than, like you said there, where most people just go, yeah, just go in for 15 to 20 minutes. And yeah, I could see where that gets very boring and you don't feel like you just don't feel like you're doing anything at that point. And I could see where something that's already boring becomes even more boring at that point. So
yeah, if you're going to put the effort in, like, just make it suffer just a little bit more for a significant amount of output. And you've probably noticed this too. I can't even think of an exception to this. Like, everyone I worked with who, once their VO2 max, once their aerobic fitness metabolism is much better, 99.9% of the time, they're like, oh my God, why didn't I do this earlier? I didn't know I could feel this much better. I just thought it was age. I thought it was stress. I thought it was this, was that. And yeah, all those things do matter for sure. But if your VO2 max is frickin' 23, I guarantee with any amount of training, you're going to feel like dog shit.
At what point, though, do you feel like just chasing more muscle growth without doing some cardiovascular fitness? And again, not saying you need to go out and run like a marathon or anything, but what point do you think there's a diverging path where it's like, hey, you're like just trying to gain more and more muscle without building some cardiovascular fitness? I feel like at some point there's got to be a path where it's okay, this is probably not going to be great from an overall health perspective, and it may even hinder some things at some point. I don't know. Is there that point, or what do you think about that?
I definitely think so. Now, again, there are some freaks I know who can do just lifting only and will still make progress. But when I've tested them, their VO2 max was pretty high, mid 50s. So there are outliers to this, but in general, what I've noticed is if you think about, okay, well, let's say your nutrition's halfway good, your sleep's halfway good. Let's say you're a natural athlete, so we take drugs out of the equation. Then what is going to be your rate limiter to adding muscle? I would argue it's probably going to be the stimulus of which you can impose upon the muscle. And yes, at some point you are getting to the curve where it's starting to flatten out. But if your goal is absolute maximal hypertrophy, then your ability to do hypertrophy sessions and get back to baseline after them so you can go in again and do it again is probably your rate limiter. And what I've seen with people is if their VO2 max is super low, they may only get in 3 high quality sessions a week, right? Could they go to the gym and do a bunch of stupid shit? Yeah, of course they could. But in terms of a percentage of 1 rep max, are they doing the program? Are they getting close to failure? Like you want to keep the quality of work as high as possible, but then you just need to, in my opinion, accumulate volume. And usually what you'll find is they can only do maybe 3 sessions a week. But now let's say their VO2 max goes from 25 to 32. Not amazing, but better. Most of the time they can add like a whole nother session. So now you can get 4 sessions in. Maybe you could get 5 sessions in, right? So now if you're keeping the quality of work high, you're still able to recover, i.e. get back to baseline again. If you said, hey, here's person A and person B, person A can only do high quality work for 3 sessions a week. Person B can do 5 sessions a week. Man, I'm going to bet on person B like all the time, right? Now, is it going to be twice as much or anything like that? No. You're already at that curve where it's starting to flatten out, but it's going to be better for sure.
And I would imagine just from like even an overall health perspective, right? Making sure
For sure.
you're maintaining that.
No question.
There's got to be a point to where it's like, all right, you need to get some cardiovascular fitness training, and otherwise, it's I just could see it hurt overall health, metabolic health, and everything like that. So,
yeah. Especially as you get we know that there's an inverse association, even with just body weight. Like even, I mean, look at drugs aside. Obviously, drugs make a big difference, but shit, how many high-level bodybuilders have dropped dead at an incredibly young age in the past 2 years? Again, you could make an argument that it's drugs. I think that definitely is a component of it, but I don't know if they're using anything that drastically different now than 5, 10 years ago. But I think it's literally the lack of, I don't want to say conditioning, but just any attention to overall health and aerobic health being a good marker of that, which would play into VO2 max, blood pressure, and a bunch of other accessory stuff too.
I feel like someone's maybe pushback on this would be like, there's a lot of like really big guys that don't do cardio, but I guess maybe the pushback to that would be, are they necessarily in the greatest health? And there's probably, again, just like when you look at long-term health, like again, we want to have more muscle, but probably at some point you can add so much muscle that, and again, probably for most people that this isn't going to be an issue, but you can add so much muscle that it could be detrimental, especially if you're not keeping up with your cardiovascular fitness in that pursuit.
Yeah, there's just more stress on your system. And again, that doesn't automatically mean that it's bad. It just means you probably actively need to do things to stay up with it. We see a lot of very large humans in the NFL. Generally, they tend to be okay for health. Again, that could be maybe they're only staying at that weight for shorter periods of time, etc. But yeah, I've seen some blood work and some numbers on, we'll say, very high level bodybuilders. Some surprisingly can be okay, but more often than not, it's yeek. It's a train wreck a lot of times. I do think overall it's been getting better. There's a lot more bodybuilders that are doing a lot more blood work and things like that now. So I do think the trend overall is getting better. But yeah, ask anyone who's competed, natural or not, like how you felt like on the day of the competition. Everyone's like, I was just barely above death. You may look amazing, but that's going to come at a high cost. Yeah.
Yeah. Super interesting stuff there. Yeah. Again, I neglected cardio for years and I'm glad that it's in my routine now at this point. Cool. I wanted to talk to you about a new paper that came out recently from Noakes, and it's Kutnick, right? Is that how you say his last name?
Correct.
Yeah. Again, he was on your podcast and listened to him there. That was the first time I heard of him. And he definitely, that was a really good episode. Like he brought up a lot of really good points around carbohydrates. And for me, I've always been a like very high carb kind of advocate, right? It's okay. Low carb's not going to work for anyone. And was definitely more on that side of things, right? And over the last couple of years going through like your stuff, metabolic flexibility, now this paper coming out and stuff like that, I've definitely been like, okay, I feel like with carbohydrates, it's just very dependent on the person, where they're at in their overall health, what's going on from that perspective. And I thought this paper was super interesting because it says that, right? Where it's like, hey, maybe some of these recommendations for super high carbohydrate intakes aren't necessarily the greatest for everyone, right? They don't necessarily say don't have carbohydrates. It's just maybe we don't necessarily need to have as much as pushed here. And I do feel like with the high carb stuff, there is a very like a big push to be like, just eat more and more carbs. You want to have more and more carbs. And again, I think for some people that might not be the right thing. With this paper, did this change anything for you, or what was your kind of thoughts on this paper as a whole generally? We can get into some more specifics on it.
I thought it was super interesting. So I've known Andrew for years, which is great. And when he was telling me about some of the stuff he was looking at, I was like, I don't know. My first thought was like, let me see the studies and what's going on. Again, not that I didn't trust him or his analysis or anything like that. And I would say that I get hate mail from everybody now for this, but I would say on the analysis that they did in the paper, I would agree with it. It does look like, again, if you're comparing it to the placebo group or the other groups that they had, it does look like that preventing hypoglycemia is by far and away the biggest thing for performance. And that kind of makes sense, right? If we go all the way back to how are humans wired for regulation of blood glucose, and we just keep it super simple. In general, we have multiple mechanisms so that you don't go hypo, you don't go too low. Again, these are, we'll say, relatively healthy people, not pathologies, not diabetics, etc. And that's because from a survival standpoint, if you go too low, you're dead, right? Like they're acutely, your brain doesn't work and it's lights out. Now, luckily, that generally doesn't happen in healthy humans because we've got all these mechanisms in play. However, we don't have as many cross-checks on blood glucose going high. And that's because, yes, high blood glucose over time is very damaging to your health, but that's not something that's going to happen within a day, a week, or probably even several months, maybe years. We don't know the exact progression, but it's a much, much longer timeline. So the system in general is very biased to anything we can do to prevent you from going too low, we're going to do. If that sends our blood glucose up to 200 temporarily, that's not today's problem. That's tomorrow's problem. We solve the issue. You're still upright. You're not pushing up daisies. We fixed the issue. So the system is very much designed to prevent you from going too low. We do know that if you do go too low, assuming you don't have ketones or anything else around, that will impair performance because your body's like, hey, if you're sucking out all this blood glucose out of the bloodstream, like you got to stop doing that. Like if this keeps going on, like some really bad things are going to happen. And then again, people can go too low, they can pass out. There can be repercussions from doing that, but those are all actual cross checks to prevent you from doing that, to stop activity, to get you back to flat levels so we can get blood flow distribution, etc. So those are all kind of the way the system is trying to prevent you from going too low. So the data they presented showed that if you view it from that lens, which gets into kind of Noakes' central governor theory, that at the end of the day, the brain is the thing that's controlling all performance and blood flow and everything else. So the brain's kind of greedy and it's going to do everything to protect itself first. From a survival standpoint, that makes sense. There's been some other research targeted to try to, air quote, prove, or in the land of research, you're trying to create what's called the null hypothesis that you're trying to disprove in order to set up your statistics. It's hard to do a well-controlled study that will 100% say the central governor theory is valid. I do think it probably is one of the better theories we have for fatigue. So I would agree that trying to prevent going too low is probably by and far away the biggest thing.
Does this change anything for you in terms of like how you would recommend carbohydrates to people or anything like that when it comes to performance?
A little bit. Yeah. So the thing that I could never figure out in my head is that I had some athletes that were usually former keto athletes who would tell me like the UCAN starch or the waxy maize or these incredibly slow releasing carbohydrates. And we've ran these experiments on them, again, anecdotal ends of 1, 2, 3, 4, probably had a couple dozen of these people over the years. And son of a bitch, like almost every time we would give them like slow releasing carbohydrate, their ability to perform went up. Like they didn't feel as bad during their runs. And I'm like, how the hell is this working? Like the mechanism never made sense to me because I'm like, I was even talking to the companies. I pulled all the original research and I'm like, the amount of carbohydrates they're getting from these, if all this research is true, is really low. And even if we just look at the amount that they contain, assume they get 100% of it, it's still very low. I mean, and I'm like, doesn't make any sense. But in light of the new paper, this makes perfect sense that those are probably preventing them from going too low in carbohydrates, preventing them from going hypoglycemic. And so that would make sense in terms of that paper, in terms of the mechanisms. Now, the caveat, or the other part I think that keeps, I don't know if anyone's really touched on this as much, most of those athletes in the paper, a lot of times they have a very high fat oxidation level. So their MFO, or what's called maximal fat oxidation, is concomitantly relatively high. So if you do the old, let's say you come into a lab, or I have a freaking metabolic cart here if people want to get tested, and you have the little thing, you breathe into this, it's looking at the amount of air going in and out. And real simply, we can look at the use of the RER, so it's called respiratory exchange ratio. And that's just simply your ratio of fat to carbohydrate use by looking at oxygen and CO2. And what we see over time is as you do higher intensity stuff, you transition to use more carbohydrates. Now, again, if you look at most of the literature, this was originally published by Brooks and Mercier in 1995, I think, and I talk about ad nauseum in the Flex Diet Cert. The average is what all the crossover theory is presented all the time. But there are people that crossover point can change dramatically. And how it changes dramatically is some people can have the ability to use fat much, much higher. So Jeff Volek showed this in the FASTER study. They showed like the probably highest levels of fat oxidation we've ever seen before. Again, there might be some issues with that in terms of what they fed them before and the validation for the things that have to be true in steady state exercise when you use a metabolic cart or indirect calorimetry. But that aside, they did find that you can get really high levels of fat use. Now, you can't get them high enough, in my opinion, to replace carbohydrates at the high end, but you can get them really high. So what I did with athletes is, and other people have done this too, is, okay, if you're a moderate level athlete, let's say you've got some fueling issues, maybe you're a little bit on the diabetic side, let's get your fat oxidation as high as we possibly can, but let's not compromise your high-end carbohydrate use. There's different ways you can go about doing that. What they find is you can run at a relatively fast pace for pretty decent performance. So I think that's the caveat, is you have to look to see how well they can use other systems. Now, the critique of that is that will you have elite level athletes doing that? In my opinion, no. Should they have a relatively high fat oxidation for health and other parameters? I would argue yes. And as a backup fuel, I think it's good. But there's been, was it elite half marathon runners, they block the use of fat, didn't change their times at all. So at an elite level, so at a very high level, you're almost entirely running on carbohydrates. And that, I think, is a different argument. Because if you go back to the review, and I think it was like 10 studies they used, they were recreationally trained athletes. If you looked at their overall VO2 max, if I remember right, there was only maybe a couple that were above 60. So it was high compared to general population. It's pretty darn good. But I would say it's not elite level status. So I think that we would need more studies and a tracer study and ways to look at this. But in elite level athletes, you're probably almost entirely running on carbohydrates. And the longer the race gets, you probably do need some high level of exogenous carbohydrates still. Now, are those providing other benefits? Are those maybe still doing a dual effect? Are they preventing you from going too low? Are they actually being used as fuel? I'd love to see, which I don't know who's going to pay for this study, but a tracer study where you could somehow label liver glycogen, muscle glycogen, and then exogenous carbohydrates and see where they go and what percentage gets used. My hypothesis is with elite level athletes, it'll be very different than recreational level athletes. I do think elite level athletes are probably able to pull exogenous carbohydrates to be used at a higher degree. And that would match some of the, if you go like to Norway and some of the Scandinavian countries, Tour de France, where they've anecdotally said that they're pushing carbohydrates to well over 100 an hour. I've heard reports of 130, 140, 150 grams per hour. Now, again, this is over one of the coaches that's done. This is over probably years. So Jake and Drupp has showed a study where you can probably train your gut to maybe use more carbohydrates, even if you split them between fructose and some other to use as transporters, etc. So right now, my hypothesis is I think the paper is good. I think most people can probably use less exogenous carbohydrates than what they think they can. The caveat being, as long as their fat oxidation is pretty good and as long as their performance is not elite level, once you start getting into elite level athletics, I still think carbohydrates coming in are probably going to be useful. To what degree? I don't know. More is probably better as long as you can tolerate them, but we just have very little published data in that realm.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That was my takeaway too. It's okay. Maybe you don't necessarily need as much. And then now it's okay. Even someone that's more recreational, I think we could take this all the way down to, I think this was more endurance athlete, but even like weight training athletes, right? I think same thing applies there, probably even more, right? Where you probably don't need as many as you think. But again, it depends on where you're at too, right? I think because I think they mentioned this too, where in the paper, for some of these people to have them take in that many carbohydrates, like it can start to maybe put them in a not great spot from a metabolic health standpoint, right? And so yeah, it's helping performance, but then metabolic health isn't as great, right? So I think that's probably something that needs to be considered as well too, in terms of how much you're going to give somebody as well too. But I also, as I was going through this, I had this thought because I made a solo podcast on this. I'm also wondering if like the metabolic health talk about going super high carbs and that leading to poor metabolic health, was it also maybe that their lifestyle stuff wasn't in check? That's going to play a huge role in that too, right? What's their sleep, stress? Are they just training like freaking madmen, right? Which endurance type athletes are probably under recovered at some point, and that is going to impact metabolic health. So I was wondering how big of a role that would play in that as well too. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or anything.
My biased opinion is I think it's a underappreciated thing. So again, it goes back to, I work with a handful of endurance athletes, more high rocks, CrossFit, more hybrid athletes, but I do have some endurance athletes I work with. And so the first question I'll ask them is what we're trying to figure out is, okay, are you doing this because you like it and you want to improve your health? Or are you doing this to be extremely competitive? And again, those are two completely different things. If you're doing this to be extremely competitive and your numbers show that you can be competitive because we can measure everything in endurance athletes and we know like how they would rank very easily. Now we have to decide how much of your health are you willing to erode for performance. Again, that's a personal decision everyone has to decide. I think there's too many athletes, and I think Dr. Kudnik has made this point too, is that I think there's too many athletes who think they're at a higher level than what they're at. And they think that if I just take in more carbohydrates, this is going to solve my training issues. And rarely do I see that solving their training issues. Now, there are some athletes who see a benefit from that. They tend to be super high stress, hard time using fats as a fuel. They're generally very under fueling, just period. So in those athletes, I do see that being beneficial, but I'm going to try to change and help them change some of their other lifestyle stuff, get their stress down, drop their training intensity, fix their sleep, eat more micronutrition. We're going to take carbohydrates and place them at other times during the day to make sure it's stored as muscle glycogen. Before, I'm just going to be like, bro, just have 150 grams of carbs for your 1 hour run. Like their GI is going to be really pissed off anyway. So I think to me, that's the bigger discussion. And if you're making the argument that, I just love running, I want to compete and do the Boston Marathon or whatever, cool. And you're not going to finish in the top whatever, and you just want to do it for your own personal PR, awesome, great. Like those are majority of the endurance athletes that I work with. Now we have to have a discussion about, okay, what markers are we going to use for your health? What markers are you going to use to determine where is the performance versus health payoff? And most of those athletes, I actually will have them do a fair amount of runs fasted. We will try to fix their nutrition, their sleep, their stress. And I've had people in the past do, pretty decent numbers, 2 to 3 hours completely fasted with just water and electrolytes. Now, again, would they do that in a competitive run like they want to set an all-time PR? No. But without technology or without a metabolic cart, if you can run 2 hours at a pretty good pace, mostly nasal breathing, I would argue you're probably pretty damn good at using fat. And that's going to probably, I think, translate to metabolic health. You're going to have a better maximal fat oxidation. You're going to be more metabolically flexible. And as long as we don't impair carbohydrate use, which is why I'm generally not a big fan of a ketogenic diet for that, because it will impair the PDH enzyme and it will impair carbohydrate use at a high end. However, fasted training will not. So I do more fasted training, longer fasted days, things like that, to upregulate fat use without impairing carbohydrates. And so I think that's a better perspective. And most people, again, this does take a little bit more time. It does take a little bit more effort. It does take a little bit more expertise. But most people within 3 to 9 months can hit most of their performance numbers they wanted and still see improvements in their overall metabolic health.
It sounds like the way you just described there is that kind of combination of, hey, we're going to improve performance, but we're also going to help with metabolic flexibility, which in turn is going to allow you to maybe be able to utilize more carbohydrates and it not wreck metabolic health. Is that kind of what you were saying there with that?
Yeah, so at baseline, then we want to see them get to higher levels of carbohydrates. However, we want to make sure they still feel good. Maybe we're looking at resting blood glucose, A1C. There's blood markers, you can look at. And if you have people, and I have some of these clients who are maybe borderline diabetics, it's a tricky balancing act, because I know if we get enough intensity and we increase their VO2 max, that's going to pull everything up. But most of these people are not professional athletes. They've got a life, they've got stress, they've got everything else going on. I tend to get them out of what I call the metabolic no man's land. If they're at 70 grams of carbs a day, that 50 to 100, 110 grams of carbs per day total, which includes fiber, everything else, is too high for them to be ketogenic and probably not high enough to provide enough benefit for the training and stress that they're seeing. So it's either, okay, we have a decision. If you want to do keto, which I have done with people, great, but you're probably going to need to stay keto all the time. Like you can't do keto Monday through Friday and hit the buffets Saturday and Sunday, because I've tried that with people and it's just a freaking disaster. Or we're going to bump your carbs above 100 so you have something to work with and go from there. The last thing too is that when people have more stress, the body's ability to buffer stress is going to come from a push towards carbohydrate oxidation, right? Because we can get more ATP at a faster rate by using carbohydrates. I know my buddy Luke Lehman from Muscle Nerds, we've talked a lot about this too. Like, we've measured lactate on some people just sitting at 2 to 3 millimolar, just sitting there. I'm like, whoa, like you're running so many carbohydrates through glycolysis that you're literally spitting out lactate and hydrogen ions at rest. This is not high intensity exercise. And to me, that means you're stuck on the carbohydrate end of the spectrum. Your body is trying to solve for that high stress by just running carbs all the time. And we have to fix that before we can expect to just add more stress to the system. And those people are a little bit trickier, because you can't, like, oh, your VO2 max is low, so let's just have you do intervals. You will just absolutely torch them instantly. So you have to fix a lot of the underlying issues in a progressive manner before you can get aggressive.
In that situation, that person adding more carbohydrates to like think that it's going to help performance, would that not be good from a metabolic health standpoint then at that rate? Would not be good to keep throwing more carbs? Or does it just depend? Maybe there's more to it than just a black or white, but
yeah. So usually with that, I want to look and go, okay, what is probably your main underlying stressor? And most of the time these people are, my job is stressful. Maybe they have kids, they have a family, they sleep 6 hours a night, they drink 4 pots of coffee, right? Everything they're doing is pushing them to be more sympathetic. And for some period of time, I might be like, hey, let's put your body comp on hold for now. Let's just try to fix your underlying stress issue. We're probably going to give them more carbohydrates. I might do a carb cycling if they can handle it. We're probably also going to do a little bit of fasting, but we have to be careful with the stress we apply to that. We're going to do some progressive cardiovascular training, but not get super aggressive. We're going to have you lift weights. We're going to have you do longer rest periods. For God's sake, please do some type of down regulation. Get a dog, walk outside, fix your breathing mechanics. Respiratory rates normally 16, 17, 18 breaths a minute. HRV is normally a floating trash bin fire. Let's eat some green things that are not Skittles. A lot of kind of what people would say is basic stuff. Let's not even worry about body comp changes yet. Let's just We need to get your system out of the car from redlining itself to go to the grocery store and build back in some progressive things to get better adaptation. Okay, great. And once we start getting that, okay, now we might play with calories a little bit more. Let's push training a little bit. Let's really try to push for your VO2 max if it's low. Okay, great. Now we're 3, 6, 9 months in. You're much better. Your fat regulation is much better. You can use fat as a fuel. You don't feel as stressed all the time. So we've got more bandwidth in the system. Okay, now we can start pulling calories out and do more of a body comp focus type thing.
Yeah, see where the biggest stressors are on their body, pull those in before you really make that push there. That makes a ton of sense. I know too, something that you've brought up and discussed is fasting, right? You're mentioning when we look at being able to improve metabolic flexibility, like being able to do a little bit of a longer fast, like you said, work up to it on one day. Do you like to have clients maybe hit like a certain threshold of fasting, like on a per day basis, or are you less concerned about like what they're doing throughout most of the week, and it's more, hey, I just want you to build up to that one day of a longer fast to help with metabolic flexibility? Or could you do both?
You can do both. There's some data on the 16-8 diet that showed it's okay. It wasn't amazing. It wasn't horrible. So in the past, I have had more clients do that. The caveat I find with that is that they have to be relatively strict with it. Otherwise, it ends up being this, oh, I was just super busy, so I just decided to fast right now. And then, oh, I overate at dinner. And then, oh, I didn't get enough protein. And you said fasting was good, so I skipped breakfast again today. And lunch wasn't really the greatest. And it can very easily dissolve into this mess of hodgepodge of just no consistency whatsoever. My preference is to take 1 day per week, usually an easier cardio day, and just work up to a 19 to 24-hour fast. I like about 18 hours in healthy people. Insulin will flatline. It'll hit the bottom in a healthy way. So whatever maximal fat pushing we get from that is going to happen there. Usually it's socially easier to do. So let's say you could have dinner with your family on, say, Monday night. Let's say Tuesday's your cardio day. If you go even 24 hours, you would have dinner with your family again on Tuesday night. So from a social standpoint, it's a little bit easier to do. And I just like having the little bit bigger stimulus. And then the rest of the week, yeah, let's eat higher protein. Let's have some vegetables. We'll titrate your carbs to your training, have some fat. And so I also find in practice, it's much easier for people to do that. And then from body comp standpoint, we've already pulled out like 1 day of calories per week. And most people, if you pull out one of the 7 days of calories per week without doing anything else, like most people can lose a half to a pound a week, somewhere around there, without really a lot of effort. And fasting is one of the weird things where you actually get time back by doing something that is more body comp specific. Almost every other intervention is going to cost you more time in food prep, more time in weighing stuff, more time in training, more time in movement. Where fasting, ironically, is the opposite. And that's how I sell it to clients. If you have a busier cognitive day, once you're adapted to fasting, which does take some time period, like load that day on, say, Tuesday, because you don't have to stop to eat until the evening. And most people are like, oh, wow, I got a lot more stuff done. And they also, at the end of the day, so violent consistency with being compliant, they were also very easy for them to be compliant. I've tried low calorie days. I've tried a bunch of other stuff. And you've probably noticed this too with yourself and clients, that to do like a 500 calorie, let's say during the day over a 24-hour period, in theory, yeah, just eat a little bit of protein, have some veggies. That approach can work, but there's just something weird about once you start eating that you just want to eat more. Yeah. And I found it was easier to say, okay, from this time period, just have water and electrolytes and some black coffee. That was actually easier for them to do just in general. And I don't understand all the mechanisms behind that, but I've just noticed that time and time again.
Is that something that you would have somebody do like year round, or would you do that in certain phases, or does it just depend on the person specifically?
Depends on their goals and what they want to do. So for most people, if body comp is the goal, I'll get more aggressive, I'd say, with the difference between high days and low days, right? So think of it as if you're doing like a carb cycling approach, a fasting day is obviously a very low carb day approach. the pro of fasting versus keto on that day is I could literally come back, let's say Monday is a training day, Tuesday is a cardio day, you're doing your fast Tuesday primarily. Wednesday, I've had athletes go up to 400 grams of carbs the next day and have no issue, right? Because fasting doesn't impair the PDH enzyme. Maybe it's too short, maybe it's a different stimulus. And as they advance, the difference between high days and low days becomes more extreme. So initially, I may just start and be like, hey, just let's find your maintenance and let's just drop a little bit from there. We'll use fasting as our caloric drain. And then over time, become a little bit more aggressive with it. The caveat there also is, what are their goals? What are they trying to do? If body comp isn't their main goal at the time, it found like if you do one longer-ish fast, 17 to 20 hours once every 3-ish weeks, that it appears to be anecdotally enough for you to keep a lot of those positive adaptations, and then you don't have to do it all the time. So if someone is, yeah, I want to do more air quotes, the lean gains where I want to try to gain some muscle, but I'm not going to be hyper aggressive with it, and I don't really want to get really fat, and I'm not using drugs, and okay, we might have them do a longer fast once every 3 weeks. It's enough that if they're like, okay, I want to become more aggressive now for body comp, they could probably drop and do the following week a 19 to 24-hour fast pretty easily. Where I feel like if they've really gone away from it entirely, it does take a little while to work back into it. Which again, not necessarily bad if your goal is I just want to maximize performance and muscle at all costs while trying to stay relatively healthy. Yeah, probably not going to have you do much of any fasting really other than your overnight fast.
Yeah, that was the one that when I heard of this concept, that was like the one time I was thinking where it would be super useful would be in someone's situation where they're trying to gain muscle. They're like in a building phase where they've been at maintenance or in a surplus for a while, right? They haven't really ever dipped back into a low energy availability state and again, they've been maybe pushing carbs for an extended period of time. To me, that would be like the perfect case of throwing that in if you want to focus on body comp and not gain extra fat and stay metabolically flexible. Because I would imagine that when your prototypical surpluses, like I would imagine that metabolic flexibility tends to go down just a little bit over time the longer you do it, which in turn I feel like would impact your body composition. So I felt like that was really the perfect time to, like you said, whether it's a longer fast every couple weeks, or you do something where you do a little bit of a longer fast, or you do some fasted cardio in that to help maintain that during a phase where you are pushing a surplus and like a higher carb intake there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. On the extreme end of the spectrum, if someone's, hey, I'll do whatever, my goal is more the kind of lean gains type approach, you can do Tuesday, Thursday is maybe your cardio days, or Tuesday, Friday is your cardio days. And in that case, I may have them use essential amino acids and ketones on those days just to try to protect any potential muscle loss because we are doing it a little bit more. And then your training days, like just hammer carbohydrates, lower fat, 70, 80 grams of total fat, protein moderate, maybe 1 gram per pound of body weight, and then just keep pushing carbs up relative to performance. Some people have hit 350 grams of carbs on those days. That's I'd say the extreme end of the carb sort of cycling approach, which I don't usually talk a lot about in public because people hear that and they're like, "Oh, that's where I want to start."
Yeah.
It's okay, like I get it, but you don't need to. I don't need to start there.
Yep. Yeah. A little too complicated. You just need to make better. All the things you said earlier about fixing a lot of the bottlenecks. Just, hey, let's eat some more green stuff every once in a while before we worry about carb cycling. Cool. Is there anything else that like maybe we didn't discuss, or any kind of closing remarks on like this kind of carbohydrate talk that we didn't discuss, or you want to let the audience know about, or anything like that?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is a couple of things that I've noticed that are kind of related to this is I think if I'm going to add carbohydrates to somebody's training, I'm going to do it after training. And I know this gets back into, oh, but there's no research to really show this. And if you just have enough carbohydrates, glycogen replenishment within 24 hours, we'll be fine. And I agree with all that stuff. But I just think the longer I've been doing this, the more I think the more you can aggressively move the pendulum from one end to the other end and do it with a faster transition, I think overall is better. Metabolic flexibility, you have carbohydrates on one end, fat on one end. How fast can you transition back and forth? I would argue that someone is healthier and probably has a higher level of performance. If all things being equal, they can go from a very high carb day to a fasting day back to a high carb day. right? The distance they're going is high, and then the transition period is very short. If you look at high level athletes, what are they really good at? Accelerating from 0 to top end speed and decelerating at the same time, right? They can probably run faster and they can probably stop faster and they can transition between those 2 points. We know there's the heart rate, like cardiovascular training. All things being equal, can you hit a higher heart rate if it's a true absolute max? And then now after that maximal effort, can you get back down to baseline faster, which is 1 minute heart rate recovery, 2 minute heart rate recovery. Those are all markers of higher parasympathetic tone. So I call this like the human dynamic range. Like how high can you go, how low can you go, and how fast can you transition? And I think the greater range and the faster transition is going to be better. So if you look at weight training, so what I teach clients to do in their session is, okay, if it's your top end set, yes, we might push heart rate. We might do things to specifically make you more sympathetic. It'll look weird, but like sitting on the end of the bench, thinking about the reps you're going to do, a lot of people like hold their hands like this or give them a focal point in front because focusing on a narrow point will make you more sympathetic. You may do a few faster inhales, etc. But as soon as you're done, I like people to just set the weight down, record what they did, and then walk around, go get a drink, try to open your gaze, get some slight movement, get your breathing back to normal. How fast can you get back to baseline? Okay, how hard can you go again? So I think on a macro level, post-training, especially higher training for, let's say, weight training, which tends to be more sympathetic, how fast can we get you to downregulate post? All things being equal, what levers do we have? Okay, insulin's probably a pretty big lever. We probably want to push insulin levels up. We want to probably provide more carbohydrates because that's going to try to get the system back to better faster. So I've gone 50, 80, 100. I think I was telling you before, like 170 grams of carbohydrates, like after training. Now, again, I wouldn't recommend people start there. You may end up there. And then, okay, how else can we do it? We can play with the nervous system. Can we do some meditation? Maybe you do some red light. Maybe you take a light walk. I've been using the shift wave device a lot, which I really like. It uses kind of pulse pressure waves along with the auditory that you listen to. Can be used for upregulation and downregulation. So if I'm training at home, I'll finish training, I'll have a high amount of carbohydrates with protein, and then I'll do a 20-minute downregulation protocol with the shift wave device that'll basically walk my nervous system back down. Again, you don't necessarily need technology. You could do meditation, you could do a light walk, you could do things like that. And what I've noticed over time doing this is it appears like at least the performance gains I make become more permanent faster. I haven't noticed that my absolute, it does go up a little bit higher, but I've noticed the variability from the top level performance to the low level performance gets less, meaning I'm raising the floor. So for example, the other day I had a PR on axle deadlift at 290 for single. And then I thought, oh, okay, how soon can I do this again? Now, usually in the past, if you hit a peak, you're probably not anywhere close to it for a period of time. So the next day I thought, I'll just try this. So yeah, I did it. I got it 4 inches up off the floor. So not too bad. I waited another day. The next day I still got 290 for a single again. So within 3 days, I repeated that level of performance, which historically I haven't really been able to do in the past. So I think there's something about downregulating that makes the performance you did more, my air quotes here, semi-permanent. It feels like it allows you to cement those gains much faster than if you just ran out and ran back to your crazy life. And again, this can be very simple. Maybe do some sauna, maybe do some breath work, maybe just take 5-10 minutes. I don't think it has to be as crazy as what I'm doing. But I know like my good friends, Dr. Andy Gelpin's talked a lot about this. Another buddy, Ben Pekulski's talked about this. So there's been a lot of overlap, I think, from what I've seen. And I don't know, anecdotally, I think there's something to it if I were to bet.
Yeah, so just making sure you downregulate after that workout as soon as possible, whether that's combination of fueling and just downregulating through breath work, or if you're lucky enough to have something like a shift wave, use that because that can help you. And then, like you said, it makes your gains from that workout more permanent, semi-permanent, as you said, which makes sense because most people just go back to their crazy lives and don't ever downregulate ever. Cool, Dr. Mike. Yeah, no, that's a ton of great information in here. Before I let you go, is there anywhere where you want to lead audience to? Anything coming up on your end that you want to let them know about or anything like that?
Sure. Best place is the newsletter. So go to MikeTNelson.com. There'll be a little button that says join my newsletter, which is completely free. They send you a cool free gift. That's probably where 80-90% of my content goes. I try to make them research-based and useful, and then also try to make them interesting too. I do have the podcast, which is a Flex Diet podcast. You can find where all your favorite podcasts are, and a little bit of information on Instagram, which is Dr. Mike T. Nelson. Yeah, probably the best way if they want to contact me is just to join the newsletter for free, and then you can just hit reply, and I'll get back to you there.
Awesome. Yeah, you got a good episode with Dr. Eric Ross, and I want to listen to. I think it just came out this week or last couple of days.
Yeah, I've been trying to replay some older episodes. So he was in 2022, and we were talking about creatine and cognition and all that kind of stuff that I've been looking at for many years. And so now it seems like creatine and cognition is the 4 years later, like the big thing. So I thought, hey, this is perfect timing because a lot of new listeners have probably not listened to it. And he was one of the guys that did a lot of that original research too.
I think I first heard him. I think he was like the keynote speaker at ISSN back in 2019 or something like that. That was the first time I came across him. Cool, Dr. Mike. All right. Always fun chatting with you. We'll have to get you back on again sometime in the summer. We'll keep on this summer timeframe here.
Good.
So really appreciate your time, Dr. Mike, and we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.